my very distinct pleasure to give the floor and introduce you to our first speaker, Linda Evans, who is a professor of education, might come up here, at the University of Manchester. Linda's research focuses on working life in education context, and it includes studies of, amongst others, university professors, the requirements that follow that title, bringing back a bit also to what David talked about, effects of institutional mergers, school teacher moral, job satisfaction, lots and lots of words here on this impressive list of achievements. And you have been a pioneer of the scholarship of research development and research leadership. So the title of Linda's presentation now, you can also see it in the program, What is Research Leadership? How may it be practiced effectively? It is very important for all of you in the audience to be very aware of the Slido link, because as you also received in the preparatory conversations from us, we really like you to upload questions throughout the day, reflections as well. After Linda's lecture, I will facilitate a Q&A session with live input from the audience, but also we might have a peek at what you have put in the Slido Q&A. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope we don't have any faults.
No.
Your slides.
Thank you. Excellent, thank you. Which is forwards?
The one that's missing is
the one is missing is forwards, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. This is my first visit to Denmark to talk about research leadership. I've been researching research leadership and researcher development for well over 15 years, and during that time I've accrued a lot of knowledge, but today I shall have to be selective in how much and which knowledge I can share with you. I hope to be provocative. I shall be very disappointed if I don't get you thinking outside the box and don't get you thinking, what? So I'm going to focus on just two overarching issues. What do we mean by leadership, and by extension, of course, research leadership? And, of course, what does effective leadership practice look like? Specifically, of course, research leadership practice. I set great store by conceptual clarity. Conceptual clarity is important because if we're going to talk about what challenges face research leadership, we actually need to know what we mean when we use the word leadership, both as a concept on its own and together with the descriptor research added to it. Now, you may think it's simple and straightforward what leadership is, what it means. And many people who research and write about leadership evidently think that, but that's not the case. Consider the following questions. What does leadership look like? How would you recognize it if you saw it? If you were a researcher of leadership carrying out empirical research, what precisely would you count as manifestations of leadership? These questions are not as easy to answer as you might initially think, as this quote here suggests. I'll allow you to read it. I assume you can all read. The problem in the field of leadership studies is that the terms leader and leadership are bandied about with little thought about what they actually mean. They're sort of applied without any real conceptual clarity, or with insufficient conceptual clarity. In many cases, they're simply used as synonyms for manager or head, a person in charge, as this quote here indicates. Such conceptually imprecise research and scholarship represents the mainstream of leadership studies. Yet mainstream research and scholarship is increasingly being challenged by a group of leadership researchers whose work is deeply analytical and whose central focus is conceptual, what leadership is. So we have a vibrant discourse, a critical discourse that reflects the perspectives that are prevalent in what's called critical leadership studies. And these two authors shown here, Neil Sutherland, an associate professor from UCL, University College London, and Peter Gron, a very distinguished emeritus professor from Cambridge, represent critical leadership studies. And another very distinguished, in fact, one of the most distinguished critical leadership researchers is in fact Scandinavian. And I'm about to show you one of his many well-used quotes about leadership. You need to understand when I show you the quote that the tone of it is intended to be facetiously derisory. In other words, making fun of and deriding the multiple ways in which weak scholarship allows different interpretations of leadership to prevail. The author in question is Mats Alvesson. I don't know if you've heard of him or not, writing with a co-author. And just to get across the derisory tone, I'm going to sort of read it out to you. According to Alvesson and his co-author, leadership may mean what top managers do, what all managers do, what managers and leaders do, what those who are not managers but leaders do, what all do, influencing, what some groups do. It may be about influencing, instructing, inspiring, meanings, attitudes, behaviours, results, etc. It may be leader-driven, follower-driven, combined, group-based, a style, a relationship, an act, a framework, an espoused belief, a set of beliefs enacted, a fantasy, an identity support mechanism, or a language game. It may be about having followers or not having followers, as all are involved in the social leadership process. Indeed, frustrated by, and here's a quote now from Alvesson, the tendency of over-exploiting a popular term by adding more and more vague and poorly defined meanings to it, thereby making its boundaries unclear and the concept increasingly unwieldy, end quote. Alvesson and his co-author Blom, the authors of this quote, have coined the term HEMBIG, which they explain as an acronym for hegemonic, ambiguous big concepts that are susceptible to such over-exploitation. And they point out that as one such HEMBIG, leadership is often used very broadly, covering everything and nothing. Alvesson and his various co-authors are by no means the only people to be concerned how the term leadership is used and continues to be appropriated. There is, as I've said, a vibrant critical leadership studies discourse, and that discourse includes a perspective that has been called leadership skepticism, or even leadership agnosticism. And this perspective casts doubt on whether there is such a thing as leadership, or whether it's a concept that we have invented and that really all we're talking about is a form of influence, social influence or interpersonal influence. The quote I'm about to show you next remains as current as it was when it was first expressed nearly 5 decades ago. Sorry, I've missed it. To treat leadership as a separate concept, it must be distinguished from other social influence phenomena. And the sentiments expressed here by Pfeffer in the 1970s are shared by many, many critical leadership scholars, and they lie at the heart of the critical leadership studies discourse. That discourse is reflected by articles and other texts with titles such as these. Leadership research, like many fields of research in the social sciences, spans a continuum. And at one end of this continuum lie the most traditional examples of mainstream research. Such research holds that leadership resides in people. It's known as the heroic interpretation of leadership, and it's predicated on the assumption that certain people are either born leaders or become really skilled at leading others and at doing leadership, whatever that may mean. At the other extreme of the continuum lies critical leadership research, and in its most extreme form, such research, which has become known as the new wave of critical leadership studies, is leadership skeptic, even leadership agnostic, and it questions whether leadership exists or is a concept that we've found it very convenient to invent and to reify by enacting it and believing in it. This last statement there is the opening paragraph of my own 2022 paper, which is referenced immediately above it. And those sentences sum up the current state of the art in leadership research. It ranges from mainstream perspectives that often synonymize leadership with headship, right through to the leadership skeptics and agnostics, the heretics who pull apart the credo that has underpinned mainstream leadership studies. And here is a small sample of such heretical perspectives in the form of quotes from critical leadership scholars. All of the quotes implicitly or explicitly challenge the great man or heroic leader mainstream perspective. Leadership is a process, not a person. Look at the dates of some of these. I love that one. Leadership is social fiction. It's a really good article, that one. 1982, leadership had outlived its usefulness. It hadn't even come to the UK then. This is Richard Nietzsche, an Australian educational researcher, not to be confused with the philosopher Nietzsche. Okay. So to sum up, these are the key perspectives that reflect the critical leadership discourse. They are that we should stop synonymizing leadership with people who hold managerial positions in a management hierarchy. I like this quote here. This, again, is another quote from Emeritus Professor of Educational Leadership, Peter Gron, Emeritus at Cambridge, whose quote I showed you a few moments ago. That's really important there. The trap that many devotees of leadership fall into, it seems to me, is to assume that because X is in charge, he or she must be the leader. We should stop equating leaders and leadership and leaders with persons, or as I like to put it, we should stop personifying it. And we should start perceiving leadership as, amongst other things, interpersonal relationality, a process of social influence, including, of course, collegial influence. But where does all this critical leadership studies leave us? What are its implications, not only for thinking about leadership, but also more practically for practicing it, for enacting it, and in turn receiving it? Does all this mean that we should stop referring to leaders and leadership? Well, ideally, I would say, yeah, that would be a great step forward. But I'm a realist, not an idealist. And if we were to be able to persuade policymakers and practitioners, including at our own universities, to stop using the L word, which I know we wouldn't be able to do because they're not yet ready for that step, then what would happen is that we'd simply find another term to replace it, and the issue would not be resolved. So what is the issue? The issue is that, in my view, and in the views of an increasingly large number of critical leadership researchers, there are no leaders and followers, because we can't label people in this way. We mustn't pre-specify in this way. Fundamentally, this thing we've become used to calling leadership, and this is something that all researchers of leadership, whether they affiliate themselves with the new wave critical camp or whether they're die-hard traditional mainstream researchers, they all agree that this thing we've become used to calling leadership is fundamentally about influence, about influencing others. But, and this is a key point, this is my main point perhaps, we all do this. We all influence others, often multiple times during a typical day. And in turn, we're all influenced by others, often multiple times in a typical working day. And this is what critical leadership researchers call the fluidity of leadership. For my part, and I don't have time to go into detail about this, but my own work is currently focused on examining influence, collegial influence, which could be labeled professional development or mentoring or line managing or acculturation or any number of things that at the end of the day, and when you reduce them down, are all about influencing. And that, to me, is the key. That's the key issue. This last point here about influence on the slide there is what I'm going to focus on today. In my 2022 paper, and I appreciate you may not be able to see the title, I don't know if you can at the back, it doesn't matter if you can or not, it's probably not worth reading anyway. In this, I argue that our focus should shift from leadership to influence, which is the more fundamental concept at play when we delve into what leadership actually is. And it's on influence that I'm now going to focus in presenting my ideas for what might be called research leadership, and how it may be practiced effectively. Now then, I'm going to talk about micro-level influence, first of all. So on a theoretical level, what we call leadership, to me, comprises basic units of activity. And these involve the flow of influence, which can be first-hand or second-hand, from one person to another or others. Examples of these could be a person's reading of and being influenced by a text, or an individual's hearing and being influenced by a statement made by another person, or an observation of another person's behavior in a specific situation, which then influences the observer to adjust or shift her or his position or direction. For it to count as influence, such agency, in my view, must prompt someone to change tack in some way. But it could be at a minuscule level, very, very slight, very minute. If you just sort of think, and rethink about something or think, oh, that's interesting, that's enough for it to be influence, ergo leadership, if you like. And this micro-level influence, which is a theoretical singular unit of what we might call leadership or what we might call mentoring or learning or developing someone, is a constant but often unnoticed feature of our lives, like a background hum that we no longer register on our consciousness. And it's in doing and receiving such influencing that what we've come to call leadership and development, and more specifically research leadership and researcher development, occurs. We can all participate in giving and receiving it, and some people may do far more giving than receiving over the course of a day or a week or a year, and we may think of these people as super influencers. You remember during COVID there were super spreaders, weren't there? Well, these could be super influencers, if you like. They may be people whose judgment and opinions we value and whose experience we want to benefit from. But that doesn't mean that they're leaders and we're not. Because in a conversation with one of them, through a chance remark we make or a subtle action we perform, we may influence them in turn at the micro level. Micro level influence then is reciprocal, but not necessarily evenly. It can be even, or it may not be. And so singular units of micro level influence are not necessarily enacted by one or a small number of dominant people. They may be, but not necessarily. Rather, it more resembles as if I were throwing a ball across this room and you were throwing it to each other so that it exchanges hands. And of course, this perspective on influencing, and then by extension on leadership, offers the opportunity for, shared and inclusive leadership, which doesn't compromise on accountability and effectiveness. So, in the context of research or researching, how may we or you influence others, and how may we or you in turn be influenced? What I mean by this is, in relation to which or what kind of issues is micro-level influence most likely to occur? Here's a question for you. When we speak of research leadership, or as I prefer to call it, influencing, what is it precisely that we're influencing or trying to influence? In this article, published just over 10 years ago, I define research leadership in those terms. And here I identify three things, as you can see, that research leadership may be focused on influencing. These are three components that I consider integral to researching or doing research. Now, this is a conceptual model that I've published several times over the last few years, and that other researchers are beginning to use as an analytical framework. It's a model of how I conceptualize doing research. It shows all of what I consider the components and dimensions of doing research. If you'll bear with me, I will explain each individual box in a few moments. And that represent these dimensions. First, here's a slightly different version of the model using a different title, People's Mode of Being as Researchers. You could call it the different elements, the different components and dimensions of people's research practice. But I actually think it's bigger, wider than practice, because it includes what underlies and what prompts or gives rise to what's normally classed as practice. So I call it professionalism. And it's as a conceptual representation of researcher professionalism, using that specific title, that this model has been published. So this is how I've published my conceptual model, and as it appears here, specifically of researcher professionalism, I do have a more generic one, which is just called professionalism. But people sometimes find it really difficult to shake off their traditional 20th century notions and conceptualisations of professionalism as a merit-laden concept, something that only some people have but not others, something that people strive for and think is worth pursuing. Even though in the sociology of work and of profession, several radically new conceptualisations of professionalism, including my own, have been offered as a replacement for what those of us who research the field consider to now be outdated 20th century conceptualisations. So I usually tell my keynote audiences and my workshop participants, if it's easier for you to think of this as people's mode of being as researchers, or even as researchers' practice, then go ahead and think of it in those terms. I will continue to call it professionalism, but whatever helps you is fine. So now let me explain each of these dimensions and components that make up what I call researcher professionalism. These dimensions of professionalism are features of any person's professionalism, an individual's professionalism. So I don't intend them to be considered as an abstract notion that applies to an abstract professionalism. I intend them to be applied to individuals, to researchers in the context of their research activity. So I'm going to start with the behavioural component of what I call professionalism. And that's my explanation of it. It relates to what researchers physically do at work. If you can think of things that potentially, in principle, could be observed, though often aren't observed because people do them in private or in, then that's what I mean by the behavioural dimensions. And at the moment I identify these different dimensions of that. The processual dimension, as the name suggests, relates to the processes that constitute people's research practice, to how they do or go about their research. It's important for me to emphasize that this is a disproportionately large amount of what people do in their research, because it includes speaking, listening, reading, writing, and all the subcomponents of those. So, it's probably 95% of what people do that. The procedural dimension relates to the procedures that researchers apply to their practice. Now, these can be formal procedures which could be institutionally imposed, or even sectoral procedures. If you're researching with human participants, you have to, the procedure is you undertake an ethical review, et cetera, you have to get it passed by your ethics committee and things like that. But it can also be your own private little procedures, your rituals that you like to do whenever you want to go and do some research interviewing, for example. You do it in a set way. That's your own little foibles. That's absolutely fine. That's covered there as well. The productive dimension relates to people's output, how much they achieve, produce or do, and what they achieve. So, we all know people who are meant to be researchers and only produce sort of one article every 5 years, and others who produce 5 articles every year. So that would be covered by the productive dimension. And finally, the competential dimension. I like to use just one adjective, one single word, competential here, but it actually relates to skills and competencies, to what they can do in terms of skills and competencies. Okay, so that's back to the model, so you know where we are. I'm now going to move on to the middle column here, the attitudinal component. I bet you can't guess what that's about, can you? It relates to people's attitudes to their working lives as researchers. More specifically, in these dimensions, we have the perceptual dimension. This is about people's viewpoints, perceptions, beliefs, mindsets, including self-perception, so their self-identities. So that's quite important. They could, the perception of research could be, has it got to be intended for societal benefit through disseminating to users? Or can it be purely an esoteric exercise? Things like that would be covered there. The evaluative dimension. Now, it's really easy for us as educators to sort of think, oh, I know what evaluation means, what evaluate. You look at something, you assess it, you think, is it good, is it bad? That's evaluating. Yes, it is, but here, let's just put that to one side and focus on the core of the word value, or values. And this dimension relates to what is important to people in their work, even the minutiae. It can include grand values like social justice, democracy, equality, absolutely, but it can also include what matters to an individual, Am I working with a research team that I like and enjoy working with? Is my department supporting me in my research? Just little things. Can I park my car? You know, little things when I'm going to do research, which seem insignificant, but are, of course, things that matter to people. Moving on to the motivational dimension, again, this is one of those that has one single adjective, but it actually relates to morale, job satisfaction, and motivation. Not to what influences them, but to how high or low they are, positive and negative. You know, we have researchers who are really upbeat and really motivated about what they're doing. Others who are thinking, oh, I never get a grant, all my articles get rejected. Oh, no. It covers all of that. So there is the model again, and now we're moving on to the third column, the intellectual component. And as you'd guess, it relates to researchers' knowledge, understanding. You can read that there for yourselves. It's about knowing and understanding. And it incorporates the epistemological dimension, which relates to the bases of what people or researchers know and understand and their knowledge structures. This is not just narrowly about, oh, Foucault, Bourdieu, Maslow, or whatever, you know, that sort of epistemological basis to your work. It's also about the basis of how you go about your work. You know, why do I always like to be interviewing people in person? What's the basis of my doing that? Because I want to establish a good rapport with them, because I've read in the psychology books that that's how you get a good response. You know, things like that. That would all be covered by that. The rationalistic dimension relates to the nature and degree of reasoning that researchers apply to their practice. Do they actually have a reason for why they do things, or are they just doing it because they don't think about why? The comprehensive dimension, of course, as you guess, relates to their knowledge and understanding what they know and understand. In my case, not statistics. The analytical dimension relates to the degree or nature of the analyticism that researchers apply to their work. We're not just talking narrowly here about data analysis. We're talking about the whole package of analysing what you do and why you do it as a researcher. Okay. Now then, I call this a conceptual model of the componential structure of professionalism. In other words, it's a model of what, to me, the concept of professionalism is. Or if you like to prefer to call it practice, researcher practice, or whatever, what it looks like. If you could see inside my head when you say the word professionalism, to me, this is the image that you would see me conjure up. But as I've said before, I intend it to be applied to individuals. So you could think of it as a blueprint for plotting the professionalism of an individual, his or her mode of being in her or his work. A key point is that, to me, professional development broadly and researcher development specifically is multidimensional. And this means that people may develop in relation to some of these dimensions, but not others. Because to me, researcher development is, as I showed you my definition of it a few moments ago, is the enhancement of one or more dimensions, any of these dimensions here. People may develop in relation to some dimensions, but not others, or to some dimensions easily and quickly, while their development in relation to other dimensions may take a little longer. Understanding researcher development as multidimensional also allows those of us who wish to develop someone, to develop her or his researcher professionalism, or if you prefer, her or his mode of being as a researcher, may find it helpful to prioritize this or that dimension specifically to pinpoint and narrow down what we're trying to influence, or if you prefer, our research leadership activity or practice. Now, I've also developed a conceptual model of researcher development. That is the componential structure of researcher development. And because, as I interpret it, professional development, researcher development involves change for the better, however minuscule, however barely perceptible, to one or more of these dimensions of professionalism, then my model of researcher development's componential structure looks very similar to this model, my model of researcher professionalism's componential structure. And there you have it, spot the difference. The only difference, as you perhaps noticed, is in the terms used. Professionalism has been replaced with the word development, and dimension has been replaced with the word change on the second model there. So this is my definition of researcher development. Now, you can see that this definition refers to the components of people's research as work, or study if they're students. And these components are, of course, the components and dimensions shown in my model. They're the constituents of what I call researcher professionalism, and you can see them again here, just to remind you. You're going to be sick of this model, aren't you, by the time I've finished? Now, even the most minute, barely perceptible change is enough for me to count as researcher development, as a micro-level episode of development. Not all professional development or researcher development has to be in-your-face, transformative in a big way development. Professional development, researcher development, is made up of countless micro-level developmental incidents or episodes, if you want to call them that, that on their own seem to make very insignificant change. But it's the accumulation of such minute change incidents or episodes that makes up bigger picture professional or researcher development. And whilst I've said that for me, just a single micro-level incident of change for the better to any one, just one of these dimensions, is enough for it to be categorized as researcher development. In fact, what almost always happens is, like a chain reaction or a domino effect, change to a single dimension prompts, often simultaneously, without anyone being aware of the chain reaction, change in another and then another, and often a succession of several dimensions. Change to a researcher's perceptions, for example, the perceptual change, might immediately spark off change to, say, the comprehensive dimension of professionalism, and then to, say, the competential dimension, and then, say, to the processual dimension, and so on. And now I'm going to illustrate for you evidence of an individual's development in relation to just a few of these dimensions of his professionalism. I can only do 2 or 3, though I could, in theory, present you with examples of every one of them. I've picked 2 quotes from a research project that allow me to illustrate 2 or 3 dimensions reported by an individual of his professional development as a researcher. Now, the individual has the pseudonym Ron, a male name, and he was a research participant in a study carried out many years ago by a former colleague and friend of mine, Professor Pat Sykes. She's now retired. She and I both worked at the University of Warwick many years ago. And to illustrate which of my model's dimensions are evidenced in Ron's case, I'm going to draw upon this article written by Pat Sykes. And the words you're going to see now are the words spoken by a university teacher, Ron, in his research interview with Pat Sykes. I was appointed to teach on the post-compulsory education and training course, but since I came here in around 1993-94, research has come to be much more of a priority. Whereas before it was optional, it's definitely expected that you do it now. Over the past few years, I've got involved in research and writing. I've started a doctorate, and I'm starting to think that I might be able to call myself a researcher. So, let's have a look at the words that Ron is quoted as having said and see if there's evidence there of any of the dimensions of professional development in my model. I'm going to do the first one for you. I used to be a primary school teacher. I'll do the first one. You can. I'll have hands up for the second one. Okay. So there we have the color coding there. Now then, the orange there, over the past few years I've got involved in research and writing. I've started a doctorate. Processual change. The processes that made up Ron's work have changed. And then perceptual change. His self-perception. I might be able to call myself a researcher. So his self-identity is changing there. Here's the second and last quote I'm going to show you from Ron. I've spread it out a little bit more. I'll leave you to read it before I then question you on which dimensions. There is a test, you see. Just take a moment to read that. I don't know how quickly you can read in English. You can all speak better English than I can, so I assume you can read quicker than I can in English. But Can anybody spot any dimensions there? Perhaps you can't remember from the model. I'm ready to tell you if you can't. No, nobody's prepared to step into the breach. Okay, let's use the color coding again. I'm now spending more time than ever before in research-related activities, and then further on, I'm now spending much more time doing research, etc. Now, we know what orange is. Orange is processual change. The processes that Ron is doing have changed. I'm conscious of this difference of purpose. He sees a difference. His perceptions of the job that he's doing have changed. He's now going to be a researcher. And I welcome it. Anybody know what this is? I welcome it. This is about his values. Yeah, I think you're going to say that. Yes, excellent. So it's evaluative change. You know, he didn't say, oh, and I hate doing it, I'd much rather just do teaching. He welcomes it. So even if he had said that, it would still be evaluative change. Some would say it wouldn't be change for the better, but that's subjective, of course, and that's one of the issues with this. So that was a very quick illustration of how my model can help reveal micro-level researcher development. I think of micro-level development, as I've said earlier, as a sort of singular unit of professional development. If you were to place professional development, more specifically researcher development, under a microscope, you'd see perhaps that it was made up of an accumulation of thousands of micro-level incidents, many of which are unobservable to the naked eye. To understand how professional development occurs, and researcher development is a dimension of professional development, of course it's a specific contextual form of professional development, we need to know what's going on inside a person's head. That would reveal micro-level incidents of professional development. Only then will we shed light on why this or that professional development intervention worked for this person but not for that person. Why, for example, Ron values rather than resents the shift in the nature of his work. Such knowledge and understanding, not of this or that individual such as Ron, but of people, researchers more broadly, is key to knowing and understanding how we may influence them, which is what many people will call leading or leadership. I'm working on formulating a theoretical model of the micro-level professional development, learning and development process, the process of what goes on inside an individual's head for her or him to experience a micro-level development episode. I don't have time to show you my model today, but I will share with you what from that model I've derived as considering the key element of micro-level development, which in turn accumulates to bigger picture development. And that key element is this, what I call a better way. Ron's development from being a university teacher who did just teaching and nothing else, into a university researcher, teacher and researcher, was effective largely because he recognized adding research to his work remit as a better way for him. And more generally, what I've identified as a key component of micro-level professional development in an individual, including, of course, researchers, which is our focus for today, is his or her recognition and adoption of what he or she considers a better way of doing something. And by doing something, I include not only physically doing something, but also mental activity, thinking about things or perceiving things. This recognition and adoption of a better way is what we do throughout life, in all aspects of our life, not just at work, as this quote here shows. I'll leave you to read that for a second. But I need to qualify that statement that recognition of what the individual, the developee, if there is such a word, I may have invented that, recognizes as a better way for them is key to their developing. And to explain what I mean by I need to qualify that, I need to return briefly to my model of professionalism again. Development in any of the dimensions of the behavioral component of professionalism, the right-hand column, sorry, the left-hand column, I can never tell right from left, left-hand column there, first column, can be imposed upon people. It is possible, of course, for a line manager or an employer to say to a researcher, you need to start publishing more papers, which would be the productive dimension, or You need to learn how to use en vivo, which would be the competential dimension, or you must complete an ethical approval form before you undertake any research with human participants. That would be the procedural dimension. Or you must start communicating better with your research funders, which would be the processual dimension. Now, in such circumstances, it would certainly be better if the person being developed, the developee, were on board, and if he or she bought into the notion that these things were things that needed developing. But, that said, enhancement to the dimensions of the behavioural component of a person's professionalism can actually be forced onto someone. You can all envisage that, I hope. With the attitudinal and intellectual components, however, it's impossible to impose change onto people. Any change has to come from within the person, herself or himself. It has to be an internal process. You can tell another person, of course, or group of people, you need to start seeing research as an important aspect of your work as an academic at this university. And you may indeed succeed in sparking off in that person or people a new interest in research to the extent that they come to value it as important in their lives. But the actual internal valuing or re-evaluation can't, at the end of the day, be forced on people. They have to see it as a better way for them currently for it to happen. And this is the case with all 7 of these dimensions in the attitudinal and intellectual components of a person's professionalism. Often people won't consciously see it as a better way. They simply adopt the revised way of thinking about something or their attitude towards something without giving it any conscious consideration. But for them to have done so, they must have unconsciously felt that it was a better way, better than what preceded it, which in some cases may be better than where something was absent. For example, if a person begins to understand a statistical analytical process that she or he previously didn't understand, or even that they weren't aware of, then the better way for them is that knowledge and understanding. It's better than the not knowing that preceded it. What does this mean for those of us who want to practice research leadership effectively, or as I prefer to think of it, to influence the development of researchers? These, to me, are the key points. Research leadership can, in principle, be practiced by anyone, of course. It's not confined to those with formal titles or roles, and to me it involves influencing, to effect change which subjectively one would consider change for the better, to one or more dimensions, the model's no longer there, but the dimensions of a person's or people's professionalism. Now often, we don't realise we're influencing others, and often they don't realise they're being influenced. And if we are intentionally influencing, though, our influence is most effective when the developee recognises something as a better way. So how may we present people with what they are likely to perceive, consciously or unconsciously, as a better way? Well, people pursue their ideal job situations, usually unconsciously. But their ideals aren't static, they fluctuate and evolve. What do I mean by ideal job situations? I'm going to show you a long quote now, which sums up what I mean by an ideal job situation. It's a quote from me. So if you've got, 10 minutes to spare, just have a quick look at this. It includes absolutely everything about doing one's job. So you see what I mean? It's the whole package of doing a job. Okay. And one's ideal job situation changes. It evolves, or it can suddenly change if you have a crisis at home, personal problem. It will change immediately. But it could also evolve over time. The closer people perceive their ideal, their current actual job situation to their current ideal job situation, this is often unconsciously done, of course, the more positive will be their attitudes to their work, the higher their morale, the higher their job satisfaction, their motivation, etc., and vice versa, of course. So a better way for a person takes that person closer, however slightly, it might just be baby steps, to her or his ideal job situation. But of course, that situation may change. And the more that people recognize an element of their development as a better way for them, the more inclined they will be to embrace it. So what makes for a better way for the 21st century academic? Well, we have a culture of performativity, and that gives rise to what I have called, along with Mirko Noordegraaf, pressured professionalism. Summed up by these two quotes. Young academics feel under pressure to excel in all areas of the academic profession. I'll let you read it. And then a quote from one of my recent papers. So, performance angst is rife. Now, it's important to know, though, for some academics, performativity actually energizes them. You know, it's the fuel that drives them. There's a good paper by Lunton Tinari, I'm not sure, I've not pronounced that correctly, who studied female academics, young female academics at Aalto University in Finland, and they were really geared up to performing and getting the best, you know, outdoing each other, as it were. So it's not all, you know, stress, and it is a form of stress, but not necessarily negative. But for others, pressured professionalism takes its toll. So a better way for some may be pursuing their research and promotion ambitions. For others, it may be sustaining a work-life balance. And this is the difficulty if you're trying to influence people. You're not sure which it is for each person. So effective research leadership may therefore involve promoting and facilitating greater specialization. This is something I've advocated in this paper here at the bottom. Probably can't see it, but you know, if some people are really good at teaching and want to do mainly teaching and just some research, just enough research, then let them take the teaching away from the ones who want to do more research. It's an interesting subject. You know, we seem to be going for generalization, whereas there's a case to be made, I think, possibly for promoting and facilitating, allowing each person to play to his or his strengths through greater specialization. So that's one option there. And just to close now, effective research leadership, therefore, involves understanding what influences people's attitudes to their work as researchers. You cannot do it without knowing how the other side is thinking and doing and perceiving things. And not being focused solely, that's a key word in emphasis there, on institutional priorities and agendas. Now I know, and I know Julia's going to say this, we have to be focused on institutional priorities and agendas, but not solely. So the key word is solely there. Adopting what I call an employee-centric perspective wherever possible. Sometimes it's not possible because you've got priorities within the institution and you've got to do that. So in other words, it's a very fine balancing act. So good luck with it. Did I go over time?
Thank you so much.
I do
yeah, please stay with us for. No, that's not allowed. Sorry. So thank you. I think you managed to both provoke and raise new thoughts and curiosities in the audience. Before I open the floor for questions, can you please take exactly 60 seconds or something like that to speak with the person next to you? And please, I mean, discuss whatever you want, but we would also be very keen for you to discuss how this amazing lecture might be relevant for the work that we are doing collaboratively here at the University of Copenhagen. 60 seconds, and then we will open the floor for questions. Okay, thank you so much. Great to see people speaking. Sorry, an abrupt interruption from the stage. So I will now open the floor for questions. And I guess we'll already change the program a bit, because I see with the lively conversations we might go a few minutes over time, but I promise there will be a coffee break afterwards and we will release you from the stage. Yeah, thank you. And can you please maybe also say who you are and where you're from?
I have never described myself as a humanist. I'm sorry, I'm a bit hard of
Yeah.
hearing. Oh, absolutely. Which is... Well, humanistic's not a word I've ever used. There's nothing wrong with the word at all, but... Yeah, the relationality. The relationality is the term that I use, which is what all critical leadership researchers use, this relationality. And that's exactly what it's about. It's about establishing a rapport and a relationship with someone. Oh, you mean from my model? No, that would be covered by the processual dimension. How you interact with other people. Speaking, listening, talking, yes, yes. It's a process, how you go about it. That's the processual dimension. And all its subcomponents.
Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Oh, well, quite easily. I mean, you break it down at the individual. The basic level is for the individual. So if you're working as a team, I've never worked in a research team. It's not quite as prominent in the UK as it is on the continent to work in teams in our disciplines. It is in the sciences, but not in our disciplines. There are very many lone researchers in the UK. That's quite common. So what you would do is simply, you wouldn't... it's a bit like when I was a primary school teacher many, many years ago. We were told, don't look at the children as a class, look at them as 30 individuals. And the same principle would apply to a team leader, a research principal investigator, or whatever you want to call the laboratory. You know, the professor in the laboratory would see his or her team as individuals. So it would apply to each person individually. Ergo, the whole team would come together in the way that it's led. You know, you couldn't treat X the same way as you necessarily treat Y or Z person. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I can't hear.
Yeah, try. Can you approach us a
come
bit?
up here.
Sorry, because
Sorry,
we don't have a runaround microphone.
Your model is sort of organizing the individual into multi-dimensional elements.
Well, not the individual, his or her way of going about his work. Yeah.
The conceptual, right? So, and following up on the question of teams, when you sort of work with an individual, and you also said it, right? When you massage one thing or reflect on one thing, then it
can often
all the different things,
yes.
right? And put that person into a team, then the one box changes in one person would affect the other person.
It could easily do, yeah.
So that's what I'm sort of thinking about. When you're working with them, you need to have this aspect of when you change this over here or influence this over here, then you sort of also influence another aspect, which means you need to be able to influence that over there. So seeing this model, I really like it because it makes sense. You can sort of start thinking about what the things are.
Yeah.
But I think it's important when you see it as when you have a responsible for number of understandings of the individuals,
yeah.
right? Then it's important to see it in this team perspective, or it's in because you don't just change this one over here. You actually also possibly change this over here and this over here.
Yeah.
You need to have that. It would be interesting to hear.
Yes, I mean, what you've just said there, I immediately brought to mind Margaret Archer's and other people's work on structure and agency. You know, that would be how the way one goes about things creates a culture, which then, and every time something shifts within the structure of that culture, then the culture changes and so on. We all contribute to it, and it's a fluid thing. I think you're absolutely spot on. You know, that's how it would work in a team. You would have, you know, just the minutest of changes would have a knock-on effect. It's a bit like, do they call it the butterfly effect? That sort of thing, but perhaps not quite on such a grand scale, within a group of people, and hopefully rippling out even further.
One last question from the floor, then the three ones very quickly on Slido, and then coffee, right? So there was a hand down there. Yes, please.
Am I allowed to know?
Oh, brilliant!
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I'm Louise, also from Health and Medical Sciences, and I work in a museum, amongst other places. So you mentioned that if we actually cancel the word leadership and stop referring to heroic individuals as the word leaders, another word would probably just like sneak in and take its place and play the same role. So if we want to change the way we talk, not just the words we use, to recognise this more relational, reciprocal, distributed forms of influence, what should we do? And I'm thinking back to the rector's remark, perhaps culture eats terminology for breakfast. Because we can change terms, but culture remains.
Yeah.
So you mentioned celebrating more diverse academic profiles, but what other kinds of culture change would actually change the way we talk, not just the words?
Well, I mean, I think changing words is a good start. It's really interesting that about 2 weeks ago at my own university, they changed the word senior leadership team to senior executive team. And I think that's right, because actually, you know, we have to have managers. We have to have decision makers. I'm absolutely not saying that, you know, but let's call them managers or decision makers or whatever you want to call them. Do not assume that they show leadership. And I think just a little shift like that, which happened at Manchester University, got people thinking. So what we are doing, I mean, culture, to change culture is very, very slow, as you know. But just terminological changes, that's what's happened I've seen during my lifetime. I'm in my 7th decade now. And I've seen how just changing a label of something 10 years later may eventually have brought about this percolation, gradual percolation of ideas that, you know, it's very, very slow. It's an evolution, not a revolution. So I don't think there is a quick fix. But also by example, you know, if people who are managers or in managerial positions start, you know, referring to people as, we're all leaders, we're all, I mean, and I'm so glad you used the word distributed, because that is the original meaning of distributed leadership. It's been misappropriated to mean the cascading down or the distribution of managerial posts. It was never intended as that. It was intended, as you have precisely described it, as this fluidity of, you know, we all influence as we're coming and going and talking and speaking. I'm not sure that's addressed your point or not.
Then I will turn my back to the audience and run you very quickly through these 3 questions. Susanna asking...
Got them here.
Yeah, you got them here. You can all see them, right? So I don't need to read it. Okay, go ahead.
Does shifting focus from authority to relation? I think that follows on immediately from what I've just said. I'm not saying that you would still have managers who would be accountable. You would have decision makers. So Julia would still be accountable. She'd be a manager, a decision maker. Leadership would be what we all do. Some more than others, some more intensely than others, some more successfully than others. This sort of influencing and through that changing for the better individuals and therefore cultures and teams, etc. So I don't think that's an issue actually, because I think you would still have the accountability, but you'd associate that with managers and bosses, whatever you wanted to call them.
Thank you.
Second one, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Can you model, I'll read the bigger picture. Yeah. Can the model catch micro change, such as reading a novel, having a conversation, listening to the... Yes, I mean, that... Sorry? That again would be covered by the processual dimension. All of those are processes that people apply. As to what it catches, well, it would only catch them if they were observable or if people reported them. I mean, we didn't actually see Ron, but we heard his report of what had happened to him, so it could be captured in that way. A lot of it could be second-hand. But yeah, it's covered by that, because the processes that people do is the very largest proportion of what, you know, processual dimension covers the largest proportion of what people do.
Thank you. The
Third
final
one.
Yep.
Rather than leadership of people, what would be the object of leadership/influence? What would be the development idea? Yes, I mean, intellectual leadership, for example, epistemic leadership would be exactly that. cultural leadership. There's a term in the UK, and I'm trying to think of it, I'm of an age where I forget words. A public intellectual would be someone who influences a discourse, a particular discourse, very, very slowly, of course, because as I said, it's... brilliant example. I don't know how much you get to see British TV, perhaps not at all, but I don't know if you've come across Sir David Attenborough, the naturalist. He did a programme several years ago, 5-6 years ago, on plastics in the sea and what damaging effect it was having on sea life. And almost overnight, I've never known this before, everybody was saying, we have to do something about this. Shops have to stop selling plastic, things in plastic, etc. So he's a prime example of how he can shift perceptions and perspectives because he's in such high regard as a public intellectual.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful keynote.
Thank you.